Okay, so let me bring in Matthew RJ Brodsky, Senior Fellow and Middle East Analyst at the Security Studies Group. Matthew, thanks for joining us on the program.
Good to be with you.
All right, so let me start with the question that I have not heard anybody in the media ask. Outside of questions of human rights, what is the American interest here? This is a foreign journalist on foreign soil. This seems to be a question between Turkey and Saudi Arabia. What is the American interest here?
Right. That's a good question. And frankly, none of the mainstream media networks have actually asked that question. I think it basically boils down to the idea that the United States is still seen as the world's policeman and as a moral arbiter for the rest of the world. So people will check in to see what the United States is going to do. But I think more importantly in this scenario is the fact that the guy was working for the media and the Washington Post, and this does give the mainstream media quite an opportunity in which to put a needle into the side of the Trump administration, which is basically to say no one's asking Britain or France really what they're going to do about this. They're simply asking the United States. So there's a real reason that there are many in the media who would like to see the Trump administration foreign policy fail, who are very much in favor of the Iran deal that Trump had pulled out of, and therefore they see the relationship with Saudi Arabia, which is against against Iran and the deal. They see that as something that's worth getting into and to trying to dismember.
Well, what's amazing about this is that we're supposed to believe the media is acting like, newsflash, people disappear off the streets of Islamic-dominated countries for being critics of the government.
Correct. And here you have an actual reform-minded crown prince, MBS as he's called, who has a reform plan that's supposed to take place between now up until the year 2030, which is the goal. And it is to modernize the economy and its society, which is something that is very badly needed. So we may not have shared values with Saudi Arabia, but we do have shared intelligence, military cooperation, and we have chosen them to essentially be the country that we're working with inside the Gulf that is going to hopefully move toward reform, which will have a giant impact on the rest of the region, especially because they're, of course, the custodian of the two holy mosques, as they're called. So this is very important that the reforms take place, and in fact, a lot of them are. This, of course, is not something that is acceptable. This type of, we should be very clear. If it turns out to be Saudi Arabia to do this, this isn't all right. This isn't a good decision on their part, and the United States should have words and a response to it. However, that doesn't mean tanking the entire U.S.-Saudi Arabia type of relationship. We have principled realism, which is what Trump articulated is going to be his foreign policy. So part of that realism is dealing with our foreign policy based on interest. We have a shared interest on many items, most specifically Iran, when it comes to the Middle East with Saudi Arabia. That's why we need to stay with them and deal with this situation.
Well, before I get into the whole, no-win situation that the Trump administration seems to be facing right now, I was clear up front that outside of human rights, what is the American interest here? But just real quick, the media has been reporting on this and condemning Saudi Arabia and demanding answers from the Trump administration without any real evidence of what took place.
Yeah, it's astounding. Even yesterday, we're already well past 24 hours at this point, where you've had reports that Saudi Arabia was being prepared to come out and take responsibility. This hasn't actually happened. We've heard all sorts of information leaked from Turkish sources. Suddenly we're taking government-controlled Turkish media, Turkey, who again locks up more journalists at a higher rate than any other country in the world currently, and we just take their word, we take it for it. And Anonymous sources, sure, throw that in there as well. So far, no one's actually provided any evidence. Now, of course, circumstantially, it looks hard to understand how it wouldn't be Saudi Arabia that's responsible for it. But at the same time, we now have a tsunami of mainstream media efforts that's just created some intrigue over this, reports everything that it wants to without having anything verified at all whatsoever. And a lot of it, again, as I said, I think stems from the fact that they want to be able to poke the Trump administration with it. Because as you say, no one's asking the question you just asked. What is it for us to deal with if this is a foreign citizen from a that happened on foreign soil? It's not an American citizen, and didn't happen in the United States. So it's confounding, but this is really part of the landscape we're in today, unfortunately, as far as the media is concerned.
Well, I get this guy that wrote a column for the Washington Post, but the Washington Post and the mainstream media at large have a funny way of deciding who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, right? Putin now is the bad guy, but he wasn't the bad guy when Barack Obama trusted him to remove 100% of declared, and I'm doing air fingers quotes, declared chemical and biological weapons. He was the good guy then, he's the bad guy now. And as far as the Iran deal, it's kind of funny. If Trump were to take the lead, allow the media to take the lead here and say, that's it, we're breaking off relations with Saudi Arabia, and in came the Russians and Chinese, the very same Democrats and the very same media would be blaming the president for allowing the Chinese and the Russians to fill the foreign policy vacuum.
Absolutely. You're right. And no one in 2013, when Obama went up to his red line and then decided to allow Russia in to take out the declared, as you say, chemical and biological weapons in Syria. This was when we first allowed Russia into Syria to mess up the country. They, of course, then came back, and again, the media didn't say anything about that really at the time. That wasn't considered a dramatic walk-down. In 2015, Russia had already been planning, as soon as the deal, the JCPOA, the Iran deal, was finalized, that was when Iran got involved immediately in the war and the air campaign. So now we brought them in to be a giant threat to NATO, essentially, from the southern flank, and to pose a threat to Israel's freedom of operations against Iran inside of Syria. All of this happened then, and no one really said anything. And right, of course, now that it's the Trump administration, everyone's flipped. The media doesn't really have a sense of a long game, how things are going to play out long term and what America's interests are. So if the interests are that we need to roll back Iran in the region, and that it would be good if we were to have the Middle East finally reform itself, then these are long-term strategies the U.S. needs to stick to that sometimes make sense for us not to make giant situations out of lesser things. Again, this is not to downplay what has happened, which could, if it turns out to be true, could be very awful. But it has to be in terms of America's interest when it comes to foreign policy.
Well, there's kind of a truth here in the Middle East, and it only gets examined when there's a Republican in the White House, that many of the people controlling these Islamic-dominated countries are varying shades of horrible, right? I mean, there's really no one in the Middle East that we could say, you know what, we agree with these people 100%, save for our friends in Israel. And again, foreign policy is not predicated on 100%. But as far as these Islamic-dominated countries, really we're in different shades of bad.
Right. And see, then you have to get down to the details, right? So in Syria, the devil that we know, those who say that it's best to have Assad in power, well, here, the devil that we know is essentially subservient. He was before subservient to Iran. Now he is absolutely to Iran and to Russia. So very much aligned with our enemies, and was supporting jihadists transferring to kill Americans in Iraq next door throughout our time when we were active there. So we know that devil. Here, when you look at Saudi Arabia, if the royal family were to suddenly fall, the internal dynamic would be then you'd have the actual Wahhabists taking over. So the people that really promoted al-Qaeda to begin with would then be in power. Or external factor, right? Because Iran would want to be in charge of Saudi Arabia and take over the country. So in each country, yeah, there's varying degrees of less savory characters who we have to work with. And that's part of, I think, what a principled realism type of foreign policy is. But it's also then taking into account what are the, the other options that would be out there. And in Saudi Arabia, we could see a very dark pit if we do some really dumb things now that await for us.
I'll leave you with this, and I'm going to look right in the camera and say this. If the Democrats and the media think this is going to move the needle on the midterm elections, I'm going to look right at you and say nobody's voting on this. I don't think any voter out there is making their decision in the final hours of this midterm campaign and saying, that's it, I'm voting this way because of this issue.
I completely agree. I mean, outside of the Beltway, I don't think this matters to most Americans.
All right, Matthew, thanks so much for joining us on the program. We'll have to get you back soon.
Thank you.